Confusion became the dominant characteristic of movement after the first week. The curfew hour changed. Los Angeles County extended the start time to 9 p.m. on June 1st, then to 6 p.m. again on June 2nd, depending on the specific municipality. Santa Monica implemented its own curfews separate from the county order. Beverly Hills did the same. What had started as a single clear rule, be off the streets by 6 p.m., fractured into a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions with different enforcement priorities and different time frames. A person living in West Hollywood and working in Culver City had to track 3 separate curfew orders just to understand when movement was legally permitted. The mobile phone alerts that were supposed to provide clarity instead added to the confusion. Different agencies sent different messages at different times. Some alerts specified street-level detail. Others gave only county-wide warnings. The expectation that you could simply check your phone and know whether you were allowed to drive turned out to be optimistic in a region where authority was distributed across dozens of municipal police departments. The first announcement came, as most administrative changes do, through official channels phrased in the language of temporary necessity. Los Angeles County issued a curfew order on May 30th, 2020, to begin at 6 p.m. The stated duration was until 6 a.m. the following morning. The stated reason was public safety during a period of civil unrest following protests. The language was familiar to anyone who had tracked similar orders in other cities during other crises. What made this different was the scale. Los Angeles County contains over 10 million people spread across 4,753 square miles of roads, freeways, and arterials that never truly sleep. A curfew here wasn't a symbolic gesture. It was a functional redefinition of when movement was permitted. Most people who heard the announcement assumed it would be enforced loosely, if at all. The city was too large, the road network too complex, the number of vehicles too vast for any real restriction. That assumption lasted approximately 4 hours. The first closures appeared on surface streets in downtown Los Angeles just after 5 p.m. Police vehicles positioned themselves at intersections, forming barriers where none had existed an hour before. The approach was selective at first: certain streets near civic buildings, certain routes that connected to areas where protests had gathered. But the pattern expanded quickly. By 6:30 p.m., major thoroughfares that normally carried thousands of vehicles per hour stood empty under functioning streetlights. Spring Street, Broadway, Figueroa south of the 10. These weren't damaged roads awaiting repair. They were intact pieces of infrastructure rendered unusable by administrative decision. Drivers who encountered the closures experienced something most had never felt in Los Angeles: the discovery that a route they had taken hundreds of times was suddenly unavailable, not because of construction or an accident, but because permission to use it had been revoked. The confusion was immediate. GPS systems continued to route traffic through streets that were no longer accessible. Digital maps showed green lines indicating clear passage where physical barriers now stood. Roadblocks expanded beyond downtown as the evening continued. The Los Angeles Police Department deployed officers to freeway on-ramps throughout the central city. The 101 northbound from downtown became inaccessible at multiple points. The 110 south saw similar restrictions. These weren't temporary closures for accident clearance, situations where traffic waits and then flows again. These were sustained restrictions that redirected vehicles away from their intended routes entirely. What this meant in practice was that the most fundamental assumption of Los Angeles transportation, that freeways provide continuous movement, had quietly stopped being true. A driver attempting to travel from downtown to Hollywood, a distance of roughly 8 miles that normally took 15 to 20 minutes, found that the direct route no longer existed as an option. Alternative surface streets remained open, but those streets had never been designed to absorb freeway-level traffic volume. The result was a city where movement was still technically possible, but no longer functioned the way muscle memory expected it to. By Sunday, May 31st, the restriction system had evolved into something more complex than a simple curfew. The basic rule remained 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., but exceptions multiplied. Essential workers could move if they carried documentation. Medical personnel could move. People traveling to or from work in specific industries could move if they could prove it. Journalists could move with credentials. The problem wasn't the concept of exceptions, it was the implementation across a region where millions of people qualified for different categories at different times. A nurse finishing a shift at Cedars-Sinai at 7 p.m. was permitted to drive home. A restaurant worker finishing cleanup at the same hour was not, even though both were returning from employment. Someone driving to LAX to catch an early morning flight was permitted. Someone driving a friend to that same airport was technically in violation. The system created a hierarchy of movement based on criteria that required judgment calls from individual officers at individual checkpoints. And those checkpoints were now appearing throughout the city in numbers that made avoidance difficult. The freeway system began showing gaps that persisted even during permitted hours. Certain exits remained closed, not because of curfew enforcement, but because of ongoing protest activity or the expectation of protest activity. The 101 exit at Alameda stayed closed for multiple days. The 10 westbound saw periodic closures at various points, depending on where demonstrations were anticipated. What this meant for navigation was that even during daytime hours, when curfew wasn't active, the road network no longer functioned as a reliable grid. A driver heading west on the 10 toward Santa Monica couldn't assume all exits would be available. The usual backup plan, if one exit is blocked, take the next one, broke down when multiple exits were closed simultaneously. This created situations where vehicles ended up miles past their intended destinations, forced to exit the freeway system entirely and navigate back through surface streets. In a city where freeway use is woven into every routine trip, this wasn't a minor inconvenience. It was a fundamental disruption to the basic mechanics of getting anywhere. Confusion became the dominant characteristic of movement after the first week. The curfew hour changed. Los Angeles County extended the start time to 9 p.m. on June 1st, then to 6 p.m. again on June 2nd, depending on the specific municipality. Santa Monica implemented its own curfews separate from the county order. Beverly Hills did the same. What had started as a single clear rule, be off the streets by 6 p.m., fractured into a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions with different enforcement priorities and different time frames. A person living in West Hollywood and working in Culver City had to track 3 separate curfew orders just to understand when movement was legally permitted. The mobile phone alerts that were supposed to provide clarity instead added to the confusion. Different agencies sent different messages at different times. Some alerts specified street-level detail. Others gave only county-wide warnings. The expectation that you could simply check your phone and know whether you were allowed to drive turned out to be optimistic in a region where authority was distributed across dozens of municipal police departments. By mid-June, the curfews had lifted in most areas, but the physical evidence of their existence remained visible for weeks. Barricades that had closed freeway ramps sat stacked near on-ramps, unused but present. Temporary signs warning of restrictions stayed posted on surface streets even after those restrictions ended. The psychological impact lasted longer than the physical infrastructure. People who had driven the same routes for years found themselves hesitating before entering freeways, checking phones for updates that were no longer being issued, planning alternative routes as backup even when no backup was needed. The city had demonstrated something that most residents had never consciously considered, that the road network they used every day existed as a permission-based system, not a guaranteed right. The streets were public infrastructure, but access to them could be modified, restricted, or eliminated based on administrative decisions made faster than most people could track. For a population that had organized their entire lives around the assumption of constant mobility, this was a conceptual shift that didn't disappear when the barricades came down. Los Angeles today moves the way it did before 2020 in most measurable ways. Traffic volumes have returned to pre-pandemic levels. Freeways carry their expected loads. Surface streets function according to their designed capacity. But conversations about that period reveal a lasting awareness that wasn't present before. People remember the specific intersections where they encountered barricades. They remember the confusion of trying to navigate home while rules changed in real time. They remember the experience of seeing familiar streets empty under working streetlights and understanding that emptiness wasn't a choice, but an enforcement. The city didn't fall apart during those weeks. Commerce continued in modified forms. Emergency services functioned. Life adapted the way it always does. But the adaptation required acknowledging something uncomfortable, that in a city designed entirely around automotive freedom, that freedom had always been contingent. The roads were always there, but the permission to use them was always subject to conditions most people never had to think about until the conditions changed.